Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Joseph Hayat, standing in for Gayatri.
30 years ago, Patrick Magee of the IRA came within an inch of assassinating the then British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in the Grand Hotel in Brighton. Many others were killed and maimed, many for life.
Irish Republican groups had already assassinated members of the royal family and Mrs Thatcher's circle, and would go on to kill more. Her successor, John Major, and his cabinet would later have to hide under their own cabinet table in 10 Downing Street as IRA rockets came through the window.
It was the height of the IRA's military threat to British rule in the north of Ireland, having more effect than any number of killings there. It may have been the moment, behind all the necessary bluster, when the British decided there was no military solution to their long war with Ireland. Our first guest, Joshua Levine, is a man who knows a lot about war and how the British have lived through so many of them. He's the author of more books on Britain and conflict than I have time to tell you about. He has also interviewed the aforementioned Patrick Magee, and I'm glad to say he joins us now on board the Sputnik. Joshua, first of all, tell us what Patrick Magee is like. Murderous, criminal, bloodthirsty?
Not at all. It was very, very polite, very thoughtful, quite inscrutable, didn't give much away, and probably was quite nervous of me because a stranger coming along and asking him some very personal questions is going to unsettle someone. But I found him very thoughtful and obviously racked with a kind of guilt. He's on the horns of this moral dilemma. He talks about the fact that he did the right thing. He was engaged in a war and he believed he did the right thing in planting that bomb. But at the same time, he's got very friendly with the daughter of Sir Anthony Berry, who was one of the victims.
The MP who was killed in the blast. Who was
killed. And he regrets hugely the fact that he killed this woman who's become a close friend, her father. And I think a lot of his life is an attempt to square that circle, try to make sense. How can you think you did the right thing, but at the same time regret that you killed certainly one person and probably more? It's very difficult. And I think with his, like so many of the Republicans, with his Catholic background, there is, even though he hasn't been a Catholic for many years, there is still this sense that a reckoning is coming. And I think a lot of his life is involved with trying to make sense of what he did and trying to justify it to himself and give his life meaning.
And many think he was some kind of electronics wizard, a mastermind, but in fact he just happened to be the IRA's main man on the mainland.
On the mainland at the time.
As it's described at the time.
He was brought up, actually, most of his young life was spent in England, in East Anglia, so he had a good English accent, so he was used as their man on the mainland, and he had a basic knowledge of circuitry, so that's what qualified him to plant this extraordinary bomb.
And he planted it under the bath, in the very room that he knew that 1 month later, exactly, the Prime Minister would be sleeping in. If the Prime Minister had been brushing her teeth when the bomb went off, as she could well have been, what would have been the main results in your view?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it's certainly arguable that we wouldn't have had a peace process at the time we did, because if the Prime Minister had been killed, it would have been very, very difficult for Britain to start negotiating with Sinn Féin at any time in the near future.
For a generation.
I mean, really very difficult. As it was, I mean, if you're thinking in terms of peace, it probably, I mean, it's a strange thing to say, but the result was in terms of damage done, it did accelerate the peace process, because what it did, if you read Lost Lives, which is almost the Bible of the Troubles, it goes through all the deaths of the Troubles one by one, and you start to see there's almost a pattern. It's very tit for tat. A Catholic killed, a Protestant killed, a policeman killed, and it's why the British Army have admitted it became a good training ground for soldiers, because it was a sort of predictable conflict. And what this did was to take it completely out of that predictability, completely out of the game, as some people were calling it, as it stood. And Alan Clark is very interesting. In his diaries, Alan Clark says that this act has a smell of the Tet Offensive about it. Now, he clearly doesn't mean in terms of
scale, no. But
what he means,
Tet was a military failure, but a political success.
Precisely. It was the effect that it had on the American public. It made them realise that the war, you know, couldn't be won. It had that same sort of effect of the Tet Offensive in that the public and people realised they weren't going away. They were going to be a very difficult unit to break down. And so, in a way, I mean, it's absolutely terrible that people had to die for this to happen, but it was one of those events that probably, in retrospect, did bring the peace process a little bit closer.
I mean, journalist David Hughes described this as the most audacious attack on a British government since the gunpowder plot. I mean, is that correct?
I think it is. I mean, it's extraordinarily audacious, and you know, as you were saying, I mean, it was brilliantly carried out. I mean, it was effective, and it had such a strong effect on attitudes in Britain and on attitudes in the government, and you see that. I mean, Alan Clark was impressed by it. I mean, to him, it was a masterstroke, and it certainly jerked the Troubles out of the sort of predictability that they'd become. On the other hand, you know, one has to look at what it was. It was also the cold-blooded killing of people, and these were not. You know, it wasn't Thatcher who was killed. It wasn't Mrs. Thatcher. It wasn't. It was. These were people much lower down the ranks and members of the families of Tories, people who had no actual input in government policy whatsoever. And that's a question I asked Patrick Magee. I said, you know, does it bother you that the people you killed weren't the people you were really going for? And he said, well, that's how war works. He said, our real worry was that we might kill a chambermaid, or so I timed it so that, you know, it was unlikely that, you know, effectively the collateral damage would be less. But it's on the one hand it was this masterstroke. On the one hand it did bring, we can say in retrospect, it probably brought peace closer. On the other hand, it was a cold-blooded murder. Indeed,
and Norman Tebbit, Lord Tebbit's wife, is disabled to this day, pushed around in a wheelchair, and he's very bitter, doesn't accept any kind of... He can't forgive, he said, Patrick Magee, because Patrick Magee has never repented. Now, talking of audacity, we know that Patrick Magee planted that bomb. We don't know who fired the rockets through the cabinet window. Arguably, that was even more audacious. It was real life, wasn't done a month before. And the British cabinet, I remember it very well. I was a member of Parliament at the time. The British cabinet were cowering under the cabinet table. In terms of an audacious military strike by a paramilitary outfit, that's a pretty high threshold too, isn't it?
Absolutely. No, I mean, so audacious to, you know, to park this van outside.
They parked the van at the back entrance to Downing Street.
Absolutely.
And fired at least 2 rockets through the exact window where the cabinet was meeting.
I mean, I think the same applies. I mean, in a way, had they killed the entire cabinet, peace would have been much further off. I mean,
that's the thing about terrorism, isn't it? That it actually, certainly in the short term, maybe even the medium term, achieves the opposite of its intention. You could not conceive of a British cabinet being wiped out and its successor cabinet treating with the people who had just killed the previous cabinet, and therefore the war intensifies.
And it's one of the many contradictions of Northern Ireland. You know, the fact was this: it has brought peace closer, and it could so easily have pushed it further away. And there's so many contradictions when you start to look closely at for example, the strategy that Sinn Féin, the political, the Armalite in one hand and the ballot box in the other, which...
This was Danny Morrison's famous phrase.
in 1981, I think it was. And on the one hand, you had the IRA very much going along with this, but the more successful the ballot box was, the more it actually stifled the military campaign, because if they were successful with the ballot box, they didn't want to jeopardise that by killing too many people or by causing outrages. And on the other hand, if they lost popularity at the ballot box, they ascribed that to the fact that they were being too outrageous with the Armalites.
The political leadership of Sinn Féin is riding very high indeed. They are the biggest party in Ireland as a whole. Martin McGuinness, who some say he denies, was the chief of staff of the IRA as the deputy prime minister, famously chuckled with the Reverend Ian Paisley, and now sits in a duo with Peter Robinson, a most unlikely outcome. Doyle is facing its only real opposition. The government in the Republic is facing its only real opposition in Sinn Féin. It's perfectly possible that Sinn Féin will be the next government in the Republic. And the demography in the north is changing fast. It's now 52-48. This strategy has worked, hasn't it?
Well, it's very interesting you say that. The demographics are changing very much, but there's always been an assumption that when there's a majority of Catholics in the north, they will vote to unite. And it doesn't necessarily follow, because the problem really, you know, if you go back 30, 40 years, there was real unfairness in the north of Ireland. I mean, the Protestants had the upper hand. They didn't live well necessarily, but, you know, they were second-class citizens compared to the Catholics who were fourth-class citizens. But things are much fairer now. Things are much more equal. You know, jobs are open the Catholics don't have necessarily the complaints that they once had. And once that's the case, then it's not necessarily, the vote necessarily isn't going to run along ethnic lines the way it once would. I think you're going to find that actually Catholics, many, many more Catholics are going to vote with the status quo because they're doing all right, Jack, than necessarily voting to become part of the South. The vote will be much more an economic vote on, you know, whether they want to be with the North or with the South on who's doing better.
A very, very interesting subject. Joshua Levine, author of Beauty and Atrocity and many really great books. I now realise I've read a lot of your books, and so should everyone else. Coming up after the break, Pulitzer Prize winner Ewan MacAskill of The Guardian newspaper, a man with an important part in the hottest film property of the year, released just yesterday, Citizenfour by Laura Poitras, on Edward Snowden. Don't miss it. Welcome back to Sputnik. My next guest has been a friend of mine for nearly 30 years. Neither of us knew back then that he would find a central role in one of the most dramatic stories in world journalistic history. A story, by the way, which would see him win the coveted Pulitzer Prize.
In May of 2013, Ewan MacAskill was having a quiet day in the office in New York when his editor told him to collect his toothbrush and fly to Hong Kong to debrief an alleged whistleblower from the United States Security Services who might or probably might not have an interesting tale to tell. That man was Edward Snowden.
The rest, as they say, is history. A history now immortalised in film, thanks to Laura Poitras, whose movie Citizenfour was released on the world yesterday. Ewan MacAskill joins us now, but first, let's have a look at the trailer for the film.
Laura, at this stage, I can offer nothing more than my word. I am a senior government employee in the intelligence community. I hope you understand that contacting you is extremely high risk. For now, know that every border you cross, every purchase you make, every call you dial, every cell phone tower you pass, friend you keep, site you visit, and subject line you type is in the hands of a system whose reach is unlimited, but whose safeguards are not. In the end, if you publish the source material, I will likely be immediately implicated. I ask only that you ensure this information makes it home to the American public. Thank you, and be careful. Citizenfour.
So I don't know anything about you.
Okay. I work for...
Sorry, I don't know your name.
Oh, sorry. My name is Edward Snowden. I go by Ed. Edward Joseph Snowden's the full name.
You and when we first met, we were both local heroes. You're now an international figure, featuring in 3 plays and soon to be 3 films. But let's start with the one that was released yesterday, which has become the hottest film property in the world. Tell us about it.
When we were in Hong Kong interviewing Edward Snowden, we interviewed him over something like 6 to 8 days, and Laura filmed the entire thing.
Including the actual meeting, the first meeting?
The first meeting. As soon as I wasn't there for the initial meeting, I was there the second day, but I'm told that on the first day she just went into the room with Snowden and straight away just set up her camera. And when I went in the second day, the camera was set up and it was just rolling all the time. Rolling. I think she's got about 20 hours worth of footage. And
so the verisimilitude is clearly there, and that's, I think, what makes the film so sensational, because it's like a flower opening up, isn't it?
Yeah, I read one critic saying some of the scenes must have been staged. It was complete nonsense. None of it. She was filming, and we just forgot about her, as you normally do in those situations, and we were engaged in questioning Snowden, and the camera ceased to exist.
And how have the authorities taken to the whole thing being immortalised in what will undoubtedly be a multiple award-winning movie?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's going to win an Oscar. She almost won an Oscar for her Iraq documentary, My Country, and this is way better. So I think she's going to get an Oscar. I haven't heard anything from the authorities yet, but this is going to do, all the articles that have been written, all those stories won't have the impact that this documentary has, because people will see Snowden. It humanises him, it shows him his geeky side, it shows him as very moral, it shows him with a sense of humour, it shows he's paranoid, it shows his nervousness and excitement as the moment closes. And that's going to change the perception of Snowden. You have to change public opinion in America, and I think that's this documentary will go a long way towards doing that.
The film doesn't show the United Kingdom in a good light. The British response has been close to zero, partly because only The Guardian really took the story up. Yeah. It never became part of the popular culture, although Snowden was elected, as we last discussed, as the rector of Glasgow University. But beyond, if you like, the politicised class, nobody really knows who Snowden is. Probably think it's Lord Snowden when you're talking about him. Why do you think that is, that Snowden revealed that Britain was spying on an industrial scale, in fact, more than industrial, was spying on us all, spying on the world, and without legal authority to do so, and yet the political class hasn't done that about it?
It's a really good question, and I'll say from the outset, I don't know the answer, but in Citizenfour, Snowden says repeatedly that GCHQ is worse, much more intrusive than the NSA. Now, why is it not been an outcry in Britain? Why the political class is not engaged? It may be, as you say, the rest of the media don't like The Guardian because of phone hacking or think we're arrogant and smug. It could be that, for 4 centuries, been a little political upheaval in Britain. People are comfortable with state security because of the IRA and the intelligence role in that. Now the role of the intelligence agencies in dealing with Islamist terrorism. Maybe the public think they're quite happy with the idea of security and prepared to sacrifice privacy. It may be just a cultural thing. We've been brought up in James Bond and we view the intelligence services in a benign way.
Well, they're more Austin Powers than James Bond in my experience. Now, Snowden is in Moscow. We learn he's now joined by his partner, who many thought had fled the coup. How is he faring? How isolated do you think he feels? What are his plans?
I saw him in Moscow a couple of months ago, and it's in Citizenfour reveals that his girlfriend Lindsay has gone to join him. I think she went and joined him in July. Before I went to see him in Moscow, I'd been told, oh, he's depressed, he's fed up, and I think former NSA director claimed he would end up like Philby and all the others, you know, alcoholic, depressed. But he was none of these things. In fact, he doesn't drink, so he's not going to end up as an alcoholic.
Oh, that's good.
He lived a life in America and Hawaii and Japan and other places he lived, different from you and me. He's part of that internet generation. He lives online. He sits up from 10 at night till 3, 4 in the morning, communicating with other people online. That's what he's doing in Moscow. So his life isn't fundamentally different from what it was in the US. He'd rather be in Western Europe. He'd rather be back in America, but he's not going back to face charges. He doesn't think he's done anything wrong.
Is there any possibility of him coming in from the cold, to use the spy jargon? Would the United States ever agree?
I can't see it. Only if it was an embarrassment to America having Snowden in Russia. They think, well, okay, it might be better to do a deal and let him go to Switzerland or Norway. But at present, I don't sense any embarrassment. And to some extent, it might be useful to them having him sitting in Russia, and they can claim that, you know, here he is, he's a quote traitor. Look at him, he's sitting in Russia.
I mean, obviously, it's stunning that you did capture this, and I mean, hats off to you. But can I ask, did you face any backlash in your life, consequently, of such a high-profile case?
It's surprising. Before, in the immediate aftermath of Hong Kong, I went back to New York, and the expectation was I might end up in front of a grand jury.
Wow.
So Guardian lawyers briefed me on how to respond, but nothing happened. For about 6 months, every time I went back into the UK, I would be stopped at passport control, but normally just for about sort of 20 minutes.
Questioned?
Well, they would say, your passport's been reported lost or stolen. Well, the only person that would have done that was me, and I didn't. So I must have been on somebody's list. I lodged eventually get fed up with it, because it was awkward. I was going in with family, and I'd be held back, and they had no idea what was happening to me. So eventually I lodged an official complaint, and it stopped.
Why has this captured the imagination of filmmakers and playwrights? I'm forever meeting people who say that they've been watching someone playing you on a stage. Yeah. Why do you think it's captured the imagination of creative people in this way?
There's a lot of reasons. I mean, spies is always a sexy subject. It's an exotic location, Hong Kong. It's this sort of sense of the moral man standing up to the authoritarian state. So I think it's a combination of these things.
Now, thanks to his revelation, we know, as I said, the central role that GCHQ is playing. We know that the Americans were listening in to the telephone of the Chancellor of Germany, one of their closest allies, the most important country in Europe, and so on. Is it all still going on?
Yeah, I don't think anything's fundamentally changed. If anything, I would have thought the intelligence services would think, look, we've got a problem of public trust. We're going to have to make some concessions, even if they're just minor, to try and win back public confidence. But I mean, there isn't pressure in the UK. There is pressure in America. There is pressure in Brazil. There is pressure in Germany and Indonesia and elsewhere around the world, but not. So there's basically the intelligence services in Britain and in America, rather than giving concessions, are actually taking more powers.
Taking more powers, yeah.
There's no real political oversight. There's no real judicial oversight. One of the committees, the House of Commons Home Affairs Committee with Keith Spaz, there was an almost comical exchange. They were taking evidence from the Interceptions Commissioner, who's supposed to be the ombudsman for the GCHQ, and they said to him, you've seen all these stories in The Guardian, are you concerned about what's happening at GCHQ? And it was like the old boys network, the old boys club. He goes down to GCHQ and says, I've seen these stories in The Guardian, is there anything to be concerned about? And they say no. And that's the extent of oversight.
Nothing to see here. Yeah. This is parliamentary oversight, British style. Yeah. Well, I'm going to make sure I see every play and every movie in which you feature. Ewan McCaskill, Thanks very much indeed for joining us on the Sputnik. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Joseph?
Well, 30 years on, obviously, from the Brighton hotel bombing, we ask, what is the turning point of the Troubles, and have lessons been learnt? Quite sensitive and heated replies on that one. But Michael O says, if they had got their target, how different would Britain be? And of course, on Citizenfour, we asked, is Edward Snowden a hero? Well, Teague says, Snowden, Manning, Assange are ever-truth martyrs and beacons of hope. And that's all we've got time for today, sir.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
Tweet us your views on Twitter. It's RT_Sputnik. And on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. But from me, Joseph Hayat, it's goodbye once again.
And from me, George Galloway, it's been marvellous.